see so many people and so many friendly faces. Thank you all for coming tonight. This is tonight, this evening, afternoon. I don't know what, at 5:30, what is that? I'm not quite sure what time frame that falls into. But anyways, I'm Beth Redmond-Jones. I'm Vice President of Engagement and Education at the NAT. I have known, thank you for the whistle. Whistles are always good. Gosh, I've known Randi for, ooh, I hate to say it, 25 years maybe? 20, 25 years?
Yeah.
And so when I got the email from one of her, I guess it was from Stephanie, saying, you know, Randi's launching her book, would you be willing to talk? I like read it, and before I could even like hit send, I'm like, yes, 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 this is like such an honor for me. So anyways, so I want to tell you a little bit about Randi before we get going. So Randi has her BFA in design, and she has a Master's of Science in Museum Education and Research. She has worked at a variety of museums, art, history, science, natural history. She's also held positions of exhibit designer, interpretive planner, evaluator, executive director. So what I really appreciate about that is that she is thinking holistically about the entire institution, because she has worked at a variety of positions within an institution. In 1989, she founded Randi Korn and Associates, which is a full-service planning, evaluation, and research firm that's based in Alexandria, Virginia. And I believe you have a New York location as well now. And in 2017, Randi passed over the directorship to someone in her business so she could focus full-time on intentional practice, which is a gift for all of us because it has brought about numerous articles, as well as this amazing book. If you haven't read it, you've got to read it, and there's a few copies will be for sale afterwards if you haven't gotten yours already. So I guess, welcome, Randi. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
To this coast. So, the first question, what is intentional practice?
That's a great question, and it's near and dear to my heart. Before I launch into, I just want to thank you, Beth, for agreeing to do this. It is an honor for me, too, to have you ask me questions, which is amazing.
Mutual Admiration Club here, I think, so.
And I want to thank Kristen for the logistical setup that you've done. It's awesome, and your communication with us over the last couple of weeks is great. And finally, the Balboa Park Cultural Partnership, who's partially sponsoring this. I appreciate that. And it is great to be back on this coast. I lived in LA for not very long, maybe a year and a half, but I do have friends in Southern California, and it's great to be here. So what is intentional practice? Intentional practice is a holistic way of thinking and working. It's not just that simple, because you have to think about the result of your work. So the way that I think about intentional practice is by showing this graphic. And so it's a holistic way of thinking and working that's focused on what is in the center of this diagram here, which is impact, and clarifying really very clearly and succinctly the impact you want to achieve on your audiences. So it's not your mission, which describes what you do. It is the result of what you do. And then once you've articulated that in a simple one-sentence phrase about the impact you want to achieve, then you organize all your work, you plan all your work to achieve that impact. You ask questions about whether you've achieved your impact by conducting an evaluation study. You reflect on the work that you've done, and you ask yourself, what have we learned? What can we do better? And once you have the sort of evidence of how well you're doing in achieving impact, you then think about the work you're doing, and you try and realign it to either strengthen the impact that you're achieving or begin achieving it because you're not really doing so. So it's holistic in that it's not just, you know, a senior team coming together to think about what they want to do. It's not just the directors of departments. It's everyone up and down and across the organization coming together to make decisions about their museum.
Wow. Okay. In the book, you talk about two past museum provocateurs that greatly influenced you. One was John Cotton Dana. The other was Stephen Weil.
Yes.
And there was a quote that really resonated with me by John Cotton Dana that says, "A museum is good only insofar as it is of use." How is this important to intentional practice?
Okay. So that is such a great quote, and I have used that quote, except I've replaced different words, and people in the office will tell you, yeah, she says that all the time. Data is good only insofar as it is of use. A report is good only insofar it is of use. So, you know, the company over the last 30 years has been very service-oriented, and we want to produce work that people use. Otherwise, we're wasting your resources, and we're wasting everyone's time. So what John Cotton Dana, even though I use that in a more contemporary way, I really do believe it's so important for museums to be useful to people. And what he meant back more than 100 years ago when he actually said it was museums need to be useful to their communities. They need to make a difference in people's lives, which Stephen Weil then picked up and ran with. And he said, and we need to be of use to everybody, in particular, underserved populations. Now, has anyone ever heard that? Right? So he said this over 100 years ago, and it's very striking to me that we still have to say it, and it's because we're not doing it well enough. So what I like about John Cotton Dana is that he really did understand that museums aren't here to employ people like us, even though we're all grateful that they are here so we can all have jobs, because we do love museums and the things that they hold, that they're there to make a difference in someone's life. And so he was the first director of the Newark Museum, which was put into the public library. So he was a library director back in the day. And then he took on developing and designing and creating a museum. And what's special to me about the fact that it was in Newark is that if you look at Newark today, the Newark Museum wears on its sleeve that notion of being for people, for all people in Newark. And Newark has a lot of underserved people. And so that museum really does live his legacy every day. And so that little phrase, it's a little bit of a tongue twister if you try and say it too fast.
That's why I had to write it out.
Yeah. It's a really important concept that is still relevant today to museums.
So given that I am an exhibits and program person, I was really struck by the idea of curiosity and the relation to extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. So can you talk a little bit about this?
Okay. So for those of you that will read this book, Beth is really pulling apart some of the ideas that are in Chapter 2. Just so you know, Chapter 2, there were about 40 drafts. It's a complicated chapter. And I rewrote it 2 days before the whole manuscript had to go to the publisher. Because by the time I got to Chapter 7, I found my voice. Then I went back to Chapters 1, 2, and 3, and it's like, holy crap, I got to redo these 3 chapters. It was easy to redo Chapters 1 and 2, but much harder to do Chapter 3, rewrite Chapter 1, but much harder to rewrite Chapter 2, because it was so complicated. So what Beth is referring to is there are instrumental benefits that museums have, and there are intrinsic benefits that museums have. An instrumental benefit is something like an exhibition meeting the Common Core standard. You have Common Core here? Common Core standards for learning that would inspire then a teacher to bring his or her students. That's an instrumental benefit, that the experience that a child, for example, might have in a museum, whether it's with a work of art or a natural history specimen, would not, that you're tying a result to something that's pretty far removed from the object itself. An intrinsic benefit is what the object exudes all by itself, and the wonder, the sense of wonder that it exudes, and the curiosity that might be then triggered from a young viewer. That's an intrinsic benefit coming solely from the object, and could have something to do with what they're learning in school, but that's not its purpose. So I do talk about intrinsic benefits and instrumental benefits, and I try to make the point that museums, staff typically, and I'm not saying anyone here does this, but might talk about museums as being beneficial to students because students might get a higher GPA by coming to a museum. Or their test scores, their standardized test scores might go up because they visit museums. And what you're doing then, so there's that whole thing that happens. Then, you get behind closed doors and everyone from museum director to museum educator talk about the passion they have for the objects and whether they're living objects, as you might find in a botanic garden or a zoo, or whether they're specimens, but they talk about their love of these objects and what those objects mean to them on a personal level. Then you might hear a director that very same day talk to a politician and say, we have generated hundreds of millions of dollars worth of income for people, or we employ 3% of the population in this city. And in all of the work that I've done for organizations, and when I ask people to talk about their passion, I can tell you not one director has ever gushed about how many jobs that museum has created in that city. And not one museum educator has ever gushed about how many school children might come through the door. That those numbers, they're not unimportant, but it's not what drives all of you to do the job that you do every day. And also I know from research that it's not actually what drives people to go to museums. They go to museums because of what museums afford them in terms of their, most of the time in terms of their collection, but also in terms of the experiences that museums provide them. So that's an intrinsic quality that's not talked about nearly enough, and we all get caught up in the numbers game. So in that chapter, I also try and weave in the idea that humans are, by their very nature, curious beings. And something goes awry when museums try and be something that they're not, or try and belittle their distinct qualities, which to me are all based in the things that they hold and they preserve and that they interpret. So when you talk about an exhibition in terms of intended outcomes that affect a school child, you're squelching any kind of curiosity that that child walked into the museum with, or even an adult. So I believe that we don't intend to squelch the awe and the wonder that people feel when they walk into a museum, but it somehow happens, sometimes inadvertently, either because of the messaging that we are working so hard to get out, whether it's about global warming or anything that is very relevant today. I just feel like we need to honor the collections that we hold and the collections that we cherish, and I believe there is a way to do that and inspire people and touch their curiosity, that we don't actually have to always talk about numbers, always have to talk about the grades that kids get in school. That's okay, but to me it's that lovely three-letter word "and." It's not this or that, it's both, and trying to reach that balance of letting the intrinsic quality of a museum emerge without trying to make it about something else. And so I realized I talked about a lot of different things, but that's why that chapter is so complicated. But so I do give an example of Dinomania, I guess it was called. Okay, remember that? And I make the point, Stephen Jay Gould wrote a very long New York Times op-ed piece about this exhibit because he was so appalled that it was in his beloved museum, the American Museum of Natural History, where he grew up, where he was in awe of the dinosaur bones that he saw, and he determined the path of his life based on that experience he had walking into that museum as a little boy. And so he was appalled that his beloved museum would have this exhibition. And I was appalled in turn that, I write in the book that it was actually very disrespectful for the objects that were there. The real dinosaurs, dinosaur bones. You don't need to have fake stuff when you have the real thing. And so, you know, and so that chapter is complicated also with changes that I saw that really inspired me to move down towards this path. And, you know, I talk about in 1994, the contract with America that my friends in Washington call the contract on America, where they would try to defund all the agencies that fund museums, which happened again in 2016, 2017, and again in 2018. And so, you know, we need to find a way to talk about what we love about the work that we do that helps people understand its value. And I feel like by always focusing on numbers and focusing on attendance and focusing on square footage, and like the worst story I ever heard was a museum director on television, fortunately it was only local TV, saying, a reporter said, "Why are you building a new wing?" And he said, "Because we have masterpieces in the basement." And I thought to myself, well, I hope so. You're a museum, right? I hope you have masterpieces in the basement. And I'm thinking to myself, that is not a reason to build a new wing. If he would have talked about what it could do for his community and for underserved populations and how it could further their, you know, inspire them to think about human creativity, this was an art museum, I would have bought it. But having Matisse's in the basement, that just didn't do it for me. So
sometimes we're our own worst enemy.
Yeah, I do. Unintended. I mean, I don't think any of us intentionally go down that path thinking that it's the right path. I just think, you know, we're sometimes pushed into a corner between, you know, we want to do the right thing, but it's sometimes hard to figure out how to do the right thing. When you're trying to balance budgets and all that, I get how complicated it is, but I do believe, as naive as this sounds, if we follow our hearts, I think we can get there. Follow our passions, what's in our hearts and what's in our minds, I do think we can get there.
So Balboa Park, as we all know, and as you know, is really unique because we have so many museums here. And it's really interesting because a lot of museums are going through strategic planning or just have or master planning, and some are under renovation. And in the museum, you talk about 3 approaches to museum planning. One being the logic model, where there's a specific project and it's a visual planning tool. You can do A to B to C to D to get to where you want to go. There's traditional strategic planning, which is top-down leadership planning. You know, executive management team says this is what we're going to do, and you guys figure out how you're going to do it within your own departments and sections. But then you have the cycle of intentional planning is the third one that you talk about. So can you share with us what this is and how this plays out in museum planning? Because I find that really, I've read this book so many times, and it's just like I'm still trying to get my head around it. So hearing you talk about it would be really helpful.
Okay, so like I said in the beginning, it's a holistic approach. It's not just top level. I mean, the worst thing that can happen is that, and this actually is a true story, a director wanted to meet with me. I met with him, and he put down the strategic plan, and he said, "I'll tell you a secret. I wrote it." And I'm thinking to myself, well, you just broke my rule number 1. And I said, let me guess, you want me to help your staff buy into it? He said, how'd you know? I said, why else would you ask me to come here? So, you know, when a plan is written by a board for staff to carry out, why would they carry it out, other than, you know, they're being told to carry it out? But where's their heart in it? So intentional practice and intentional planning is really, its intent is to be inclusive. And I know that sounds very Pollyanna, but I've seen it work. So everything is workshop-based. So there are 7 principles to intentional practice. 5 of them have to do with the cycle of intentional practice. The center being very, very important, and a museum has to think about their result as being something greater than themselves. So being self-serving in your impact statement is not allowed in the workshop. And that's a really hard one for people because they want to have higher membership and higher, attendance figures. No, that serves you. That's in service to you. So what difference do you want to make in people's lives? So that's the first principle. And then as you move around the cycle, conducting sound planning to articulate the impact you want to achieve, conducting an evaluation to determine whether you've achieved that impact, reflecting to see what you've learned about your work, and then alignment, the quadrant people love to hate, and I can talk about that more. But alignment's about strengthening the relationship between the work that you do and the impact you want to achieve. So those are the first 5 principles. The last 2 principles have to do with how you do that work. And so the first how is asking questions. You notice that those are all questions up there. And that's because I do not tell people what to do. I don't do what that director did. Wrote a strategic plan and then said, yeah, here guys, carry it out. So I ask questions. That's what I do. And inquiry is a very powerful tool that levels the playing field. It not only levels the playing field, but it brings everyone into the conversation. So asking questions, I use inquiry. The other how part is collaboration, across the museum collaboration. And so everything is workshop-based, can accommodate up to 25 people, and this is like not magic really, but I figured out over time that we can have 5 working groups of 5, and they have to be interdisciplinary, so it's not just, so if we had this room set up, just kind of like now, look at the person next to you. Do you know that person? All right, you've chosen to sit next to people you know. That makes sense. We're all humans, right? So if I left these 25 people to their own devices, the curators would sit with the curators, the educators would sit with the educators, and everyone would be happy in their little groups, but nothing productive would get done. So I do ask there's a core team that I'm working with, and I ask them to create 5 interdisciplinary groups, and that's who they work with. So a museum educator, or curator, or maybe someone from administration, and then maybe someone from security, up and down and across. I don't have favorites, right? So there's assigned seating when people come in, and they're a little nervous. It's kind of like, the cafeteria in 7th grade, I don't want to sit at that table. I want to sit at that table. So, so everything is very planned, you could say.
So if it's planned, though, how do you, does it allow for creativity in the creative process? Because it sounds very structured.
It's very structured, but people are so relieved that it is structured because I do have this slide here, because I knew this would come up. So I show this in the workshops, because I say to everybody, so here's what's going to happen. This is what our agenda is for today, and it's going to get messy. And I don't want you to worry about it, because it's my problem, really, it's not yours. I will take all the notes home that you have, I ask the questions, you work in your little groups, and I'm going to collect everything, so you have to have good handwriting, because I need to be able to read it. And that's what it's going to feel like at the end of the day. But over time, we're going to find that arrow, and we'll get there. It's going to be okay. I don't want you to worry about it. And everyone, I want everyone to try and feel really comfortable in the messiness. Because it's okay. So the exercises that I give are very deliberate, and they're very clear. People know what is expected of them with each exercise, and they're working together, and everything is pre-planned. I did my work back in the office, so like at the workshop, I'm just like, okay, everybody, this is exercise number 1. But I do visit the groups, make sure they're on track, and it's quite remarkable. You know, what also happens in these workshops, no one is allowed to complain. There's no time. I mean, I'm a taskmaster. So,
I know that.
And one of my other rules, besides do not write a strategic plan and then ask staff to carry it out, my other rule is every workshop ends by 3 o'clock. Because people are tired. And so is Randi.
Yeah.
I'm a morning person, which we can talk about that later too.
Yeah.
My tea. So,
Yes.
Everything is very organized and it is engineered, but that's what makes it really doable for people, that they're asked to think about some really hard things in these workshops, and they don't have to worry about anything other than having conversations with their colleagues to try and address the issues at hand. So, creativity, you asked me about that. So, as you said, I have a BFA, so I would never in my life engage in work that didn't allow me to be creative in my work. I'm used to the, I'm used to the messiness. It's very sensitive.
Yes.
I'm used to the messiness, and the greatest, you know, enjoyment for me is when I turn on the computer and open up Word, and it's that nice white sheet, and I have to fill it up. I have to create an exercise. Even though I've been doing this for a while, it doesn't matter. It never gets easier to create those exercises because every problem is completely different from the last. And every museum is unique in their own way and quirky in their own way, and I have to be responsive to that. So I never know what the problem is that I'm called in to address specifically. I mean, I know generally, right?
Yeah.
Because there are exercises in here that, you know, I had to fill the pages with something, right? So these are what would the word be? Unadorned. So if you look at an exercise in Chapter 5, and that's where all the exercises are, and something feels like it could work, you might have to actually apply some of your own creative thinking to make it really work and fit into your organization. And that's intentional on my part, you know, and so I might have the skeleton of an exercise, but I gotta fill in all the blanks. So it's constantly pushing me to think and do better at what I do. So let me mention this about the cycle of intentional practice. And this is what Chapter 7 is about. But I kind of sprinkle throughout, so you don't have to actually wait till you get to Chapter 7, or you can just go right to it and see what this is all about. But intentional practice, at the end of the day, is about learning. For me personally, my learning, and for the folks I work with, their personal learning, their professional learning, and for the museum, the organization's learning. And though it's very light, you see those arrows around the word impact? This is a cycle, and it is never-ending work. But it's also like so invigorating because you are learning. So I give articles for people to read as part of the preparation for the workshop, because I want everyone to kind of be on the same page. So I can assign an article twice, 3 months apart, and it doesn't matter, because who you are 3 months later is going to be different from who you were 3 months ago. And so you will see, I have read, every time I sign an article, I feel like I have to reread it myself, because, you know, what if someone asked me a question? And I have read certain of Stephen Weil's articles at least 50 times. And I still learn from it, because, you know, it looks like the same pair of glasses, but they're a little bit different because I've learned along the way. And I'm always learning, and that's my hope when we work with everybody, that they're learning along the way, and that we're all learning together. And so, moving along, you know, I wish life was more a continuum, but it's actually more like a cycle, which is why I bring in the logic model, because I don't like it because it has a beginning and an end, and life isn't like that. You know, so it's a little bit of a philosophy, but I see things always in cycle and moving around and getting, so if this were three-dimensional, it would be a spiral going up because we're getting better at our work as we move through it. So it's very creative work, and I think people feel in the workshops like they're being asked questions that they've never been asked before, but even though they're really simple questions, they're really hard to answer.
Yeah. So in the book, you also talk about Jim Collins, who's a research and business author, and when I came across his name there, I was kind of like, why is this in here? Right. And there's a circles here. So this hedgehog concept, I was like, hedgehog, like, oh, I love hedgehogs. Like, oh, I realized not the hedgehog that I thought you were talking about. So can you talk a little bit about what this is and why this resonated with you? Because this is a business model. And
yes, it is a business model. And so very early on in my thinking about all this stuff, I did a brain dump, and I gave it to a colleague to read up in LA, actually. And she said, have you ever heard of Jim Collins? I said, who? And I had never heard of this guy, Jim Collins. And she said, you really ought to read his stuff. So I went out and I bought 2 of his books. I read them and I thought, oh my God. And I wrote him a letter. I wrote Jim Collins a letter. And I shared with him an article that I had written, and he sent me 2 signed books. I was, super happy. But I didn't, what struck me about this was, and the reason why my friend said, have you ever read Jim Collins? You really ought to read it, because he has this concept and it's really similar to what you're thinking. So I'm so glad I read it, because, it's one thing, me sitting in a room thinking these thoughts and jotting some things down. It's a completely other thing when someone as smart as Jim Collins has done all this research, and he has the evidence to demonstrate that these ideas are important. So passion. Let me does everyone know who he is? Okay, yeah. So he did all this research, and he had evidence that demonstrated that what you're deeply passionate about and what you're the best at, and then he worked in the for-profit sector, what drives your resource engine, that if you have those 3 things, you can become a great organization. You can move from being a good one to a great one. And I was thinking about, those ideas, not the drive resource engine. It's not that I don't care about money, but it's not what is it's not what drives me. And I know it's important to museums, but I don't think it should be the driving force behind a museum. But certainly passion and what you're the best at. And then I switch it out for what you envision your audiences will experience. So to me, the public part of a museum's work is as important as all of you sitting here and what you bring to the table. And it's balancing your passion, your museum's distinct qualities, with what you envision for your audience, which would require perhaps knowing something about your audience. So conducting some research to help you feel like you have a sense of who they are in the context of what your museum can offer them. So when I read his stuff and learned about the hedgehog concept, I thought, I have to pull this in. Because he's done the research and he has the evidence, and so it gave my ideas some chops, if you will. And so I was just grateful to him, and I had to tell him that, and I just, I still use it. It feels very old. It's from 2005, but to me it's still relevant, and it's still part of the very first workshop that we do, which is all in the book. And you all can do it at your museums.
So earlier, I'm going to back up here, you had talked about impact statements a little bit. And I know that some of Jim Collins' work and everything that you've been thinking about, and how does the museum get to an impact statement that is, because we all talk about mission, we all talk about vision, but
so just to clarify, mission is what you do. It usually has verbs like we interpret, we conserve, we protect, we educate, we inspire. It all describes what you do. What is the result of that on the audiences you serve? It's like flipping the coin over and looking at the other side and saying, yeah, what impact do we want to achieve with our audiences? This is what we do. What is the result of that? So looking at it just like in this park, how many museums are there?
16. So,
Okay,
yeah.
that's an amazing cultural resource. I mean, phenomenal. The fact that it's in this city. What is the result of all these museums and all this amazing work they do on the populations that you serve? What does that look like? What would happen if you took this resource away? What would this city be missing? What would the population say they would be missing? So just exploring that. So to me, an impact statement is, it's really hard to get to, but we do it. We have 3 exercises that we do. A passion exercise, really hard, a really simple question, but we ask it several times. So I might say to you, what about your work at the Nat is most important to you? We can actually do it here.
Oh gosh.
Oh,
Okay,
I don't want to put you on the spot.
People connecting with nature.
Why is that important?
Because nature is really powerful in its own way, but it's also, I've had my own personal connections with nature.
And so why is that important?
Okay, I don't know like where this is going. This is hard.
So I don't need to drag you through this, but
Thank you.
This is one of the exercises. I'm letting you off the hook there, but we're going to talk later.
Later, yeah, for sure.
So we do a passion exercise, and these are in 5, the groups of 5, and everyone has a chance. And so there's a board member, possibly, and there's an administrator in one group with the educator and the curator. And do you think the board member has ever even thought about that question? Most likely not. So this happens, and we, I sort of don't want to give away well, you might not believe me, so I'll give it away. So people start off in all these different places, and they end up in one little place, and it's usually the same place. That they're all there, they didn't know it until that exercise, but they're all there for the same exact reason. And so that's all recorded, because people take notes. Each group self-appoints a scribe. The second exercise is a large group exercise, and it has to do with distinct qualities. I changed the concept slightly. Instead of what you're the best in the world at, what is your museum really good at? What makes it distinct? And we end up with usually like 5 or 6 Post-its, large sheets of paper around the room. And I say to everyone, okay, let's look at this. You can't be really good at all these things. What are the top 3 things you're really good at? And that's a really hard question for people to answer. But we go through the process. Well, what I try and do is wait for somebody to say, hey, wait a second, we're not good at all these things. And if that doesn't happen, I usually have to ask a question. But I might be divulging too much of my method here. But so that's the second exercise. And then we save the last one for after lunch. And throughout, I'm kind of talking a little bit about some of the ideas and, just kind of sharing some definitions of words, and so we all get on the same page. Then the last exercise, sadly, it has to come as the last one because it is truly the hardest, and it's envisioning outcomes. And so it's really hard for people to think about outcomes. They immediately go to what they want to do. They think about their actions, not the result of their actions. So this is where I totally do a round robin and help people focus in on result as opposed to action. But there's a missing piece here, the who part of the equation. We can't actually talk about outcomes at all until we've talked about who. So what happens in a planning call, so between all these workshops that we have, we have these momentum calls. And it's to keep the project moving. I might give assignments to the core team. But one of the things we do in this momentum call before this first workshop is I ask them to identify 3 target audiences. All right, that takes a couple of hours. There's a big conversation that happens. It's really hard because museums want to be all things to all people, and I believe that that is not possible. It is not possible, anyway, if you want to achieve your intended impact. So we ask people to identify their top 3 priority target audiences. It's not forever. In 2 years, you can take one out after you've achieved some success with it and put in another one. Nothing is forever. Even the impact statement that we end up with is a draft. Always will be a draft. So I collect all the data from these 3 exercises, and I begin to create what I call an impact framework, which has the mission, the intended impact, it has the passions of staff, the museum's distinct qualities, and it has the 3 audiences. That's all page 1. Page 2 are the intended outcomes for those 3 audiences. And we review this together. We make lots of changes over many months. This is a work in progress. It could take 6 months, it could take 9 months. There's no exact recipe or exact period of time in which it takes, although I do have a schedule in the book, kind of a generic schedule. So you might want to read some impact statements, or I can read them.
I was actually, I pulled up the Wild Center because I was hoping that you would just give everyone a little background to the Wild Center, and because this is a little call out in the book, and it really, it's just a tweaking of words.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And it is dramatically different.
Yeah. So the Wild Center's in the Adirondacks, upstate New York. The Adirondacks is a public-private partnership because it's a park, but people live there. And the Wild Center is a really unique place. It's essentially a natural history museum. Its most famous program is probably the Youth Climate Summit, which has been going on for probably a decade.
Yeah.
They were invited to the Paris Accord. They've been invited to the White House, the other White House. Their programs are very, very innovative. They had this mission statement. I'll read the first one. Ignite an enduring passion for the Adirondacks where people and nature can thrive together and set an example for the world. So we worked with them to do an impact statement. I'll read that. People deepen their connection to nature and consider their role in sustaining their natural world for future generations. So you can see that the Wild Center ignites an enduring passion, and the impact statement is people deepen their connection to nature. So once they had that impact statement, they thought, oh, now we don't like the mission statement. So they reworked that, and this is where they landed. Actually, at press time, this is where they landed. Big secret. Ignite an enduring passion for nature, the Adirondacks and its story, where people are working to thrive with nature and offer an example for the world. So you can see how, I'm going to read those 2 again. Here's the first one. Ignite an enduring passion for the Adirondacks where people and nature can thrive together and set an example for the world. Tad arrogant, just a little bit, as opposed to ignite an enduring passion for nature, the Adirondacks and its story, where people are working to thrive with nature and offer an example for the world. So it's just a little deeper into what the museum evolved to, because the first mission statement was written before the doors were open. So that's just an example. So you're always checking back your work. That's why it's never ending. And the impact framework, that is the deliverable, eventually, it always says draft on the bottom. It's always a draft. I don't own it, the museum owns it, and once our work, once I can go home, and they're on their own, they can change it as they see fit. And that's totally fine, it's theirs. because it's all a draft.
So I know that there are a couple CEOs in the room, but there's a lot of staff here, and I'm sure a lot of people are thinking, how do I get this to happen at my museum? Does this take CEO buy-in? Is this something we can do like grassroots, under the radar? Yeah. You know, how do we make this happen?
I'm an under the radar gal.
Yeah,
totally. Yeah. So. You know, it's always best if it comes from the top, but sometimes that can't happen, and everyone has, all of you sitting in this room have a sphere of influence, and if you like some of these ideas, form a reading group and get started in thinking about these things. So we've worked at the higher levels, but we've also worked at departmental levels, where a museum department, education, most of the time it's education, who will call us, they want to get stronger, and they want to set an example. In the case of, I've been working with the Whitney for a decade now. We first got a call from education saying, we're getting a new building and the architect is asking us all these questions and we have no idea what to say. I mean, we're so untogether. And I started working with them, and it's been a complete joy to watch, and actually Catherine Potts wrote one of the case studies, and I asked her to write about her journey as an intentional practitioner. Because I've watched her grow into an amazing leader at that museum. And so there's all kinds of reasons why people would call us, but it can happen at the department level, it can happen at the top, it can happen, you know, lately I've been getting requests to do board work, and I've not said yes yet. But it can happen at that level. So there's all different ways, and I just urge people to, this is what we do with the young staff. I mean, we have something we call a coffee break. It really is a coffee break, but each of the young folks in the office, it rotates around. They have to identify an article that they want to read and discuss with everybody else. It's one way to get things going. Now, there could be a revolution at RK&A, that's totally fine. But that's how, you know, just getting people excited about ideas. And, you know, I once had someone say to me, I want my director to pay attention to me and, you know, do some of this stuff. And I said, well, what have you done? Well, I've given him about 5 books. I said, okay, don't give him any books. He's super busy. Find one article that you think is a really good article, just one, and leave that article for your supervisor or whoever. You know, less is more. Almost all the time, less is more. That is actually one of the principles of intentional practice. Doing less to achieve more, to go deeper.
So before we open this up to question and answer, I'm going to throw something at you that's totally not related to museums or anything else. So one of my favorite interview shows is Inside the Actors Studio, which is hosted by James Lipton. And at the end of every interview, I see some smiles. I think people know what's coming.
Except for Randy.
Except for Randy. He asked 10 questions, which are from a French series called Bouillon du Culture, which is hosted by Bernard Pivot. So I'm going to ask you these 10 questions, and then we'll open it to question and answer. Okay. What is your favorite word?
I have a lot of favorite words.
Just one.
Okay. I love the word clarity, mostly because it's so hard to achieve, and I'm just like always reaching for it, and you know, it's just an aspiration. It's an aspirational word for me, the word clarity.
What is your least favorite word?
Oh, that's easy. So, so those of you who had workshops with me know that there's a word I ban. The word engage is banned.
That's great.
I don't mind if someone's getting married and they say I'm engaged. That's okay. It's proper use. Mm-hmm. But we have to think of another word other than engage when we talk about our relationship between museums and people.
Okay. What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
The mountains.
What turns you off?
Weather that prohibits me from going to the mountains.
What is your favorite curse word? And this is being taped, just so you know.
Okay, so you all have to tell me if this is a curse word, but I love the word nabbit. Does that suffice?
I guess so. What sound or noise do you love?
I'm going to go back to nature. I mean, the sounds of nature. Whatever it ends up being, whether it's you know, walking outside in the morning and hearing the birds. When I get my paper, I still get a paper on my doorstep. Whether it's when I'm hiking, the streams, just the sounds of nature, whatever they may be.
What sound or noise do you hate?
If I'm hiking, a plane going over me. I mean, I just find that to be really disturbing.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Okay, I will embarrass myself right now. Farming.
Farming?
Farming.
Oh, farming.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow, I would never have guessed that one.
I really just want an acre. That's all I want.
Yeah? Okay.
I live in a city, and I have 3 little tiny boxes.
Okay. Yeah. What profession would you like not to do?
Professions that put money as the goal, like investment banking or something like that. It's just like, I don't get that. It doesn't fit in my brain.
If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
I'm glad to hear there are pearly gates. Let's see. Hi, Randy. Here's your acre.
Thank you for coming and being here.